Just make me the host so that I can share my screen. Okay, you are
Now
the
the
host.
full command is in your hand.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay, bye. Bye, Feroz. Bye. Okay. Without much ado, let's get on with it. So today's unit is about migration policies implication for women. Now, we have been over a period of time looking at the fact that how uh, the international labor market has been typecast based on gender. And in a couple of units back, or in a couple of units back, we distinguish between gender and sexuality and sex. And then in the last unit, we looked at how the sexuality and sexual identity plays out. Now, that is why I was talking about how migration becomes a very complex issue, especially when we get the gender identity and the sexual identity into place. So let's look at a couple of migration policies in the SAARC region. The objective is the rationale behind enactment of policies. Now, we need to understand also when we look at the SAARC region, for example, or developing countries per se, more often than not, women are less educated than men. Again, traditional gender role talks about women as caregiver, men as bread earners. And when women are less educated, more often than not, they tend to go into care industries or household or house care or housework industries. Most of these industries are invisible. For example, the concept of housewife is almost an invisible job. It almost is tantamount to saying that the women is not doing any economic activity, because somewhere down the line, housework has not been quantified into an economic activity in terms of economic output. Now, once it becomes invisible, then more often than not, there is exploitation. So we are looking at policies enacted for women in international migrants. The demand for female worker is higher in care and emotional work. There is some sort of a typecasting for women in terms of gender and care work. Hired in areas largely and these are typically semi-skilled or unskilled. So, for example, it is normally said you don't need any education to take care of for housework. So it inevitably comes in the unskilled category and primarily invisible in nature. Since unskilled and semi-skilled worker often requires little or no education, overseas employment for these workers become exploitative and difficult to regulate. So now countries need to work out whether do they create laws if these unskilled or uneducated women go out as migrants to a host country, or it should be a market regulated function. Now, it's a very difficult thing, and various countries look at it in various ways. By far, in SAARC, they try and regulate women migrants, and then it becomes some sort of a restrictive policy. So, we will see to fulfill demands of international labor markets, and inevitably underdeveloped or developing countries are easy fodder because of high population, lower skill, uneducated. Caregiving sectors are typically women from these countries are taken for caregiving or migrate for caregiving. Large population to supply labor and availability of cheap labor. So South Asia becomes one of the major hubs for supplying this kind of a labor. And then whenever a policy is put into place, now that policy almost becomes, when you try and regulate it, the regulation can almost become restrictive. So for example, if you say women are illiterate, and we need to, or a nation needs to regulate so that the illiterate women are not taken and exploited, and you put a policy into place, now that policy may become restrictive. And if it becomes restrictive, then more often than not, the restriction is for the women, for the female gender. not for the male gender. So two schools of thought represent the different views on enactment of regulating policies. One school believes large number of migration policies for women are restrictive in nature because inevitably the state feels that women are uneducated and they will be exploited physically, and hence they should bring in some policy so that the women are discouraged from migrating. And these guys regulate the migration flow, reduce the possibilities for regular and legal migration. And inevitably, whenever you bring in a policy, please also understand the nature of migration. Say, for example, a lot of migration happens because of poverty and economic conditions. Now, if a woman, let's say there was this case of women from Punjab who were taken to the Middle East and were exploited. Now, these women were looking at a better condition because there was a certain restriction in terms of policy, in terms of going through specific government agents. These women more often than not took a non-governmental route. So how do you regulate? So it becomes a very difficult thing on regulating. Some scholars believe that the regulating policies stand as a major tool to protect women's migration. So it can be looked at it from both ways. Any policy, it's something like this. When you say that you tell your child, do not do this, it could be looked at both ways. It could be looked at the fact that you are trying to regulate your child and restrict the child from doing and experiencing something. At the same time, it could be looked at the fact that you are regulating so that the child does not come in harm's way. It's both ways. So, for example, H-1 visa plays a major role in US, United States of America. It's a legal entry permit for temporary workers. And if the US authorities or the US states starts fiddling around with the H-1B visa, in terms of number of visas issued, it has a direct impact because more often than not, if a spouse or the child has to accompany a person, a male going, then reduction of these visa will impact. Any change in percentage of H-1 visa will directly impact the flow of immigration to the United States. So it almost becomes a restrictive law. So, for example, the government of India has allowed women to out-migrate for work, but with certain conditions. Female domestic workers can only take place through state-run agencies. Now, inevitably, a state-run agency might have its own set of rules and regulations and complications. And more often than not, a lot of women might think that the state-run agencies, which will go through major, in terms of rules and regulations, are too much of a bother, and they will go through agents who are not authorized or who run rackets. And more often than not, a lot of them get stuck. Overseas employment for nurses, policy frameworks have made it mandatory that the immigration of nurses for overseas employment in 18 ECR, immigration check required countries required immigration certificate from the Protectorate of Immigrants. So India has, an ECR requirement, and an ECR requirement is something like this. If an applicant wants to go abroad for employment, particularly to 18 ECR countries, and has not passed 10th grade officially, in an accepted Indian education system, they will be required for an immigration clearance. Now, this could be restrictive. And when this is restricted for some people, they might, take the help of some agents who, because of their poverty and, literacy status, can take advantage of them. And it happens, which typically was the case with the Punjab women who went to the Middle East. So these are the ECR countries, 18 countries, which includes Jordan, Yemen, Sudan, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Lebanon, Thailand. So these are ECR countries. Let's look at a couple of our SAARC nations in terms of what their laws are. So Nepal, for example, Earlier, for Nepal, India was the most popular destination countries for Nepali migrant workers. The Gulf countries' oil boom and the opening of its economy provided additional destinations. There are many restrictions for women migrants up till 90. However, as the economic situation and women's education and the demand for women in labor market became better, the government eased up the process. So there is a Nepal Foreign Employment Act 85 permitted female workers to migrate, but with some restrictive clauses. Prohibited recruiting agencies from providing to children and women without consent of a guardian. Now, if you'll see in many of the SAARC countries, we will see there is for women, there is a consent. Now, obviously, one would feel that it's a restrictive, it's a restrictive law. However, there is major trafficking of girls which are happening, for example, let's say from Nepal. The consent becomes important to from the viewpoint that the girl, if she is not married, then the consent of the parents. However, one needs to understand the fact in case of poverty and the illiteracy nature of the household, more often than not, there are these people in villages and towns who are known to the families and thereby trick the families into giving consent for trafficking of these girls. But however, the Nepal talks about a consent. The guardian stands for a mother or father for an unmarried woman, and the husband will be considered as a guardian for a married woman. According to Foreign Employment Act, no gender discrimination shall be made while sending workers for foreign employment, according to the act. So it is eased out. The migration is eased out. However, for girls, they need a consent from the guardian, and for a married woman, from the husband. Nothing shall prevent sending workers for foreign employment. So obviously there is no on paper, there is no discrimination in terms of either gender. It was proposed that the permission for guardians in local government is required. So they have eased the process further, saying that if a female is going for an employment for the first time, then for the first time and a permission is required. For subsequent travel, no permission is required. The timeline of mobility clause clearly indicates that the policymakers have adopted both restrictive clause as well as non-discriminatory clause for female migrants. Because a whole lot of trafficking of women are happening from Nepal, hence this restriction is put in place. So this was about Nepal. Let's look at Sri Lanka. In 1977, a major push for migration from a country. See, we will look at these SAARC examples, and then we look at the example of Philippines, which we had looked in earlier units. Philippines has a well-defined out policy for migrants, especially female migrants, because they have accepted the fact that a whole lot of the country will run out of remittances from these migrant workers. So for Philippines, the whole women migration or female migration process is very well laid out by the state, and it is the policies are very well laid out, and they are able to implement it very well. Whereas for the SAARC region, for example, a couple of countries that I put out the example in this unit, you will see that they are still trying to figure out laws. Early 80s women, Sri Lanka early 80s women accounted for majority of migrant workers. 93, 97, 75% of the migrants. Many were involved in informal work, especially domestic work. The decline in women migration due to policy implemented by the countries. Sri Lanka encourages skilled workers over unskilled workers, and we will see this also becoming a major issue. So when a policy is, favoring a particular set of worker, for example, a skilled worker, And then there is a gender, angle involved. More often than not, the unskilled or the semi-skilled people will take the illegal route for migration. So there's something called a family background report provisions restrict the flow of migrant women workers from the country. Were formulated in 2007. It was implemented by Ministry of Foreign Employment Promotion. Under the FBR, women migrating as domestic workers need to document their reproductive and family history for applying an overseas job. This comes from the fact that women's primary role as caregiver and homemaker, and if these women migrate, then the families back home will suffer. So inevitably, the pressure of caregiving has been put on the female gender. Now, you can argue it both ways, which scholars typically do, saying that this is more of a restrictive practice to prevent the female from migrating and getting a better economic opportunity. Initiates many necessities, which on the one hand to protect the well-being of the children, and on the other hand clearly restrict the mother of the child from migrating abroad. So now the state has to walk a very fine path. As per FBR, mothers of older children 5 years and above are allowed to migrate abroad for domestic work, with a clause that alternate care arrangement is made to ensure the protection of the child behind. If you see it from one point of view from the state, it does make sense. However, in the absence of the fact that some people can argue that this is actually restricting for the female. Like what we saw as an article from the Filipino migration, that when these women go out, what happens to their families back home? How do these mothers and children negotiate once these females either come back or the children grow up? The FBR capped the minimum age for migrating women. The age bar is different for different countries. Also capped the maximum age of 55 years. The maximum age was revised and shifted. FBR introduced two categories of women migrants. One is with children and one is another without children. So you see, even the policies are moving to be flexible enough to take care of new economic situations. More often than not, states try and keep up with the time. In case the states do not keep up with the time, then inevitably there would be problems which would have to be taken care of. Let's look at Pakistan. In fact, Pakistan has one of the lowest female labor participation rates in the world. In South Asia, the country reported the lowest female participation, many reasons. Prominent being low education, low skill, and invisible informal sector. As per ILO report, involvement of women in overseas migration remained very low. So, for example, 40,000 female workers went abroad between 1971 and 2019. Females represented only 0.4% of all migration over a period of time, and largely because of illiteracy, because of a cultural factor, and so on and so forth. Largely depends on the decision of family members whether they seek overseas employment. The government policies are not encouraging for women. Has restrictive age limit policy for migrating women looking for overseas employment. Limit is 35 years for women working in domestic work category, relaxation of 5 years. So inevitably, a whole lot of these policies actually discourage women from migrating abroad for work-related activities. Women also have to take consent from a male guardian to complete the process. Male guardian can be a father, brother, husband. Absence of a male member, mother can give assent. Reporting migrate because of culture. A large number of women reported migrating to as domestic workers to Gulf countries because of cultural similarities and distance. So there is there, but one of the lowest rate of women migrants is in Pakistan. Let's look at Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh, I found out a UN document, one of the major labor suppliers. Just a minute. Give me a sec. Yeah. So the battery went down. Uh, so Bangladesh is one of the major labor suppliers. As per Migration Forum Asia report, female represented only 1% of Bangladesh overseas labor migrants. Even though it's the major labor supplier, females represent only 1%. And again, like Pakistan, due to cultural, educational skill and policy influence. Number of female workers who travel alone, unaccompanied by members, was negligible. Severe restriction between 2000 and 2006. A lot of cultural factors come into picture here. So percentage of women in total migrant workforce 1991 to 2017. So if you see, the largest was in 2015, about 18.66%. So it has been steadily increasing, and somehow, for what reason, between 2015 and 2017, it went down. It also could be the possibilities of all these women because of the picking up of the Bangladesh textile industry. Bangladesh is a major hub today for manufacturing in terms of textile, and a lot of brands have their manufacturing facilities in Bangladesh. The women might be getting employment in Bangladesh and might not be going out. It's quite possible. Cost of migration are high, even higher if migrant workers use private recruiting agencies, and this is across. And brokers in both the sending and receiving countries that control employment and work permits create a gap in protection. And we have seen across units that there is inevitably gaps in protection for workers, and especially for women. Bangladesh female workers tend to pay the cost of migration in advance, as they rely most. And we've seen from the Punjab experience also, the agents take money in advance, what they call dalals, and they end up paying them excessive fees. So in fact, the Punjab case recently, these women were picked up or were taken to the Middle East by agents which were known to the women. They paid much in advance. They paid in advance in excess. So I picked up this article from asiapacific.unwomens.org, helping women migrate safely. So if you see, helpless and desperate, she took up man's offer of work only to be sent to a house where she is locked up without food. Exploitation. After she sold her land to generate 70,000 taka needed to travel to Dubai, she realized that the middlemen had duped her. And this is a generic story because inevitably official channels become, process oriented or become an overhead. And then most of these people who are stuck between poverty and illiteracy tend to use agents and get stuck. So Bangladesh has something called an Overseas Employment and Migrant Act 2013, regulates registration of migrant workers, including female domestic workers, which says that you are supposed to provide a contract, right to information, file a civil suit, right to return home. There is an Expatriates Welfare and Overseas Employment Policy 2016. They have a full policy on it. 6 policy directions: safe migration, protection, regulation, specific directions for ministries, separate chapter on female workers who migrate for specific type of work, promote skill development, trained females. In fact, if you send me a mail, I can send you the presentation. We got late today. So there is, and Bangladesh has signed bilateral agreements with a lot of countries. I have listed out various countries. Again, the agreement is on enhancing employment, taking care of the migrant workers. Then there is something called general laws. So, for example, ILO keeps working in the state of general laws. ILO has enacted many instruments to regulate and promote workers' rights. There's a convention concerning decent work for domestic workers, number 189, and there's a recommendation number 20201. So ILO works in terms of recommendations, conventions. So there's a convention 189, domestic workers get protected against abusive practices. The provisions are enacted to protect the fundamental human rights of domestic worker, provides requirement for freedom of association and collective bargaining. Now, again, remember, these are conventions. The host country may choose to follow or may not, in spite of the fact they might be signatories to these conventions. There's also a possibility that who will enforce these conventions, because nature of the work is largely invisible. There's a convention on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, 1979, protection of the right of women. There is an international convention on protection of the right of all migrant workers and members of their families. And in spite of that, for example, in the US, we saw that a couple of years back during the erstwhile regime, they were putting children separate from their parents, which goes against this convention. Inhumane living conditions, rights of freedom of thought, expression. There's a UN protocol to prevent, suppress prison, especially women and children, 2000. In exploitative situation, provides migrants with right to human treatment, aims to stop transnational organized crime and trafficking of women and children. However, there are a lot of issues and challenges, considering the fact that women are largely illiterate, they are largely semi and unskilled worker, get hired on low wages, work for long periods, then COVID-19 didn't help the situation at all. The condition of domestic workers mostly remain unnoticed. Invisible nature of work is a major issue and challenge. Then there is an issue of illegal migration or migration without. Look at the fact that we call them illegal migration, whereas this is migration without documents. Illegal migration is more from a security point of view, a security lens point of view, whereas these are people who are migrating without documentation. Many incidents of illegal migration and human trafficking have been reported despite existence of policies. Migrants without documentations are most vulnerable. In fact, if you read the news items a couple of days back, there was a fire in Johannesburg, South Africa, where people without documentation were living and many people died, lost their lives. Summing up, concept of identity-based sexuality. This particular summing was from the 72nd unit. So inevitably women are, so let's not look at this summing up. Inevitably women come under the uneducated and less skilled section. Domestic work is more than, it is hidden from public eye. It is exploitative. In spite of the fact there are policies by various countries, more often than not, who will enforce? There are ILO conventions, there is a UN convention, and yet these particular jobs, which is in the care industry, are exploitative. There is this again, these references and suggestions are from the last unit. unfortunately, I don't know because I moved my laptop. I think one of the older slides got inserted. So that was about this unit. Any questions? Let me stop the share. Stop share. Okay. Any questions? Today was a slightly hurried up in the sense the laptops gave a problem. Sanjeev, Veera, any questions? If you send me a mail on my mail ID, I can share the PPT with you.
We have your email ID, sir.
Perfect, perfect. So if you send me an email, then I can share the PPTs with you.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Sir, what comes under emotional work, sir?
Emotional work. So, for example, let's say taking care of people with mental disabilities.
Oh, yeah, that comes under care actually.
Care. See, inevitably, care also is emotional work, psychiatric work.
Okay.
So, a lot of caregiving may not be physical caregiving, may be emotional work.
Yes.
So, for example, old age or young children will be typically caregiving, but dealing with mentally ill patients or mentally challenged patients will be emotional work.
Yes. Sir, can we say like this in developing countries, many youngsters are migrating and parents are staying alone. And that emotional support is being given by somebody else. Like they will hire a, what we call a woman servant or a male servant, and they provide all kind of care and they look after actually in place of children.
Inevitably, with caregiving, there is an emotional support which comes in.
Yes.
So a lot of people who have been left behind are in the older age group, and more often than not, people who have migrated typically give long distance support. Today with internet and calling facility, a lot of long distance support is there, as well as a certain amount of financial support, whereby the older parents or the older people left behind employ somebody to give them physical and emotional support.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Absolutely, Sanjeev.
Yes. And on the negative part, some senior citizens or the parents, they are joining that old age group homes or something like that, sir.
Correct, correct. See, inevitably in the West, the concept of old age home came in because of the fast pace of work and the younger generation being too, see, that was the difference between the West and the Orient. The Orient had the concept of families, family support. There was no security net per se by the state.
Yes.
In the West, the state started giving that security net, and thereby the concept of old age home was there. The same thing is being replicated in India, for example, today.
Sir, the another point is that, sir, with regard to that nursing sector, sir.
Correct.
Of late, what we are observing is that earlier in lot of hospitals and caregiving type of work, only we used to find care lights.
Correct.
But now there is a major shift, sir. People belonging to, coming from Bihar, Chhattisgarh, and Odisha, even from Northeast, we are finding a lot of people working in hospitals as well as in petrol bunks, etc. Sir.
Correct. So, for example, in caregiving, especially in let's say nursing care, typically the first movers were the Keralites. In fact, in one of the earlier classes, I talked about this story about this 5,000 nurses which migrated to Germany after World War II for caregiving. And in locally also in India, a lot of communities have realized the fact that there is major work in caregiving because the caregiving sector is booming.
Yeah.
And with a lot of migration happening, the people who are left behind need caregiving. So inevitably, the way the capitalism model works, it's a supply and demand. So wherever there is a demand, the supply will be there.
Yes. Sir, last question. I mean,
Please,
it's not a question actually. Just I'm sharing my point of view actually. So with regard to the illegal migrants word, sir. So prior to receiving this course material, I used to go through the lectures of one Miss Melissa Siegel.
Okay.
Melissa Siegel, she is a professor working for UN University, Netherlands.
Okay.
She is specialized in migration studies.
Okay.
And in one of her lectures, she told that what we call is illegal migrants, we should not call it as illegal. Instead, we should call it as an irregular.
We call it an irregular. Okay.
Irregular.
Okay. Correct.
So, can you define it, sir? I mean, in our study material and lectures, we wherever we go through it, we find the illegal word only in majority of the cases.
So, Sanjeev, inevitably, what is illegal? If you see the story of human history, the story of human history is a story of migration. For example, the modern human being evolved in Africa and migrated over the whole world.
Sir.
So if you read the history of any community or any nation state or state, you will see that there has been continuous migration throughout the history of the nation or state or of the world. So what is legal and what is illegal? Now, what has happened is once with the formation of nation states, then everybody started looking at from the security lens. Now, illegal and legal is a term which has come from a state security lens. When you say this particular is illegal, you are talking with respect to the laws of a particular nation state. But human beings have always been migrating. So that is why I said it is undocumented migrant, the one who has not, or irregular might be a better word, because legally when we are talking about that, the person has got a document to come to another country. But the fact is, what about victim? If there is, look at the Rohingyas. So if Rohingyas were pushed out, where do they go?
Yes.
So if they are pushed out, and if you see India throughout its history, right from the time when it was not a nation state, has always been more than welcoming to every person or every community which was there in the world who were persecuted would come to India, including Britishers. Okay. As we have seen in the sexuality chapter, it was Britain who was which brought in this conformity or specific boxes, silos on sexuality. India was always a sexual and a gender fluid state. And the Articles 377, which is a which was criminalized in India, was actually a contribution of British. It was not an Indian thing. It was not natural in India. If you see, Kama Sutra, if you see the Chandelas, we were always a sexual fluid state, a gender fluid state. So India has been more than welcoming. So today, when in the Indian polity, we talk about illegal migrants, we are looking at it from a security lens.
Yes.
So irregular is a better word. And that professor is absolutely right. Undocumented or irregular.
Absolutely got it.
Okay.
Sir, thank you.
Okay, perfect then. Have a nice... Veera, any questions?
No, sir.
Okay.
No, everything
how's the child doing?
Yeah, nice, sir.
Okay, the mother and the
both are very
mother
good.
and the child are doing very well, huh?
Yeah. Both
Good,
are
good,
very
good.
good.
And I hope the father is also doing very well.
Yes.
Yeah, I was a little bit of busy last week also. Now, up to 6 months, a little bit of busy, sir.
No. See, Veera, after a child, there is no 6 months of busy. This is a continuous busy state because
Yes.
because the child keeps growing and new states come about. And every
Yeah.
time you think you have crossed one state, you will get into another state.
Yes.
I think that's the fun of parenthood, and it's an amazing experience as you go about. And
Yeah.
make sure the time goes very fast. The children grow very fast, so enjoy this
Yes.
time.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so you have a nice weekend, and I'll see you next weekend.